Buenos dias. I'm here today to talk about some tests we conducted with small unmanned aircraft. I'll refer to them as SWAS. I'd like to start with some acknowledgments. We did these tests. There's a group of us that have been working together for many, many years, and Philip Groves was the instigator. Brad Alcorn was accomplished, and Jim Chandler provided a lot of support for the effort. Michelle she's a biomedical researcher, and she provided a lot of her statistical assistance during the project. Jacek is a marine biologist for NOAA Fisheries, and he's a PhD student. My job was pretty much to chronicle the tests, write them up, and make some sense out of them. So we began our surveys of Hell's Canyon along the lower Snake River in 1987, and we conducted manned helicopter surveys 4 to 9 times a year. And our goal was to count fall chinook reds, and it's a very long study area, and it's very remote. Now, I flew my last flight in 1991, and in 1991, we knew that there were 9 known spawning sites used by Snake River fall chinook in the Hell's Canyon reaches. And so counting reds during those years, it was a very different operation. We were doing presence absence work. We wanted to make sure they were spawning in the wild. So when we'd fly the whole river. We'd get a complete census. We'd check every site that we thought where reds would possibly be. And it was a fairly easy process. The reds showed up as white ovals contrasting against the dark river bottom. We could hover 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, collect GPS coordinates, notes, etc., and move on. Now, Philip Groves started flying in 1992, and he flew from 1992 to 2014. And over that time period, the number of known spawning sites increased to 227. So it became a very different game to count reds. Not only were there a lot of sites to cover, but the use increased. And so Philip would come to a site like this, and he'd look down, and there they are, and he'd count. And so during this whole period, we always had a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist in the helicopter. It was always a team effort. And in 2012, I had a young man. It was his first year. He was in the helicopter, and he came back, and he sat in my office one day, and he was fidgeting and just looking uncomfortable. And I said, "Well, what's wrong?" He said, "Billy, do you really think we're counting those reds?" And they weren't. I mean, it got to a point where it got inaccurate. So not only do we know that manned surveys from aircraft can be inaccurate, we also know they're fatal. In Washington, Idaho, British Columbia alone during the past 20 years, there's been 44 fatalities. So a few years ago, a gentleman named Bob Van Buskirk came, and he gave me supervisory training. And he gave me this NFES blue card. And on that card, there were 12 warning signs that called "watch out" when we're flying these surveys. And one of the questions I felt was really interesting on that card is there a better way to do it? So SWAS came on the scene about 10 years ago. There's been a lot of work. People use them to observe elephants, koala, whales, and so forth. And one of the benefits of small unmanned aircraft is you can program to fly them autonomously. So you can go to a spawning site, give them GPS waypoints, and it will fly those waypoints. So the flight path is also repeatable, and there's permanent imagery taking of whatever you're counting. Some of the limitations is under the current restrictions, we have to fly them within line of sight. And secondly, with the aircraft we used, we had a 20-minute battery life. So now thinking back when we started these surveys in '87 and all the way to 2014, we were getting complete census counts of the reds. And now because of this limited battery life, we're forced into a situation to start looking at survey sampling methods, subsample a portion of our sites, and then make estimates of total annual red counts. So by 2010, Philip had logged about 153 flights. We lost a pilot and a couple of close colleagues on the Clearwater River flying red surveys. And Philip is a real gadgeteer, and he said, I'm going to get a SWAS. He said, it's time. I'm tired of flying. We can do this. And so what I'm going to talk about today briefly is I'm going to talk about proof of concept tests that we conducted and briefly talk about the outcome of our survey sampling methods. So as far as proof of concept goes, to fly a SWAS, you have to have a certificate of authorization from the Federal Aviation Administration. And I could tell a lot of stories about this and go on for quite a while. But the bottom line is it took us 5 years to get the permit to do the flights. And so the way we did a lot of our tests is we contracted with an organization that had already had a COA, and they were a big help. But by 2015, Idaho Power Company was managed to get their own COA. So I'm not picking on anybody here because we've all done field work and we all know we make mistakes, human error and so forth. But one of the things that I observed was that using SWAS for aerial surveys was a learning process. The first year we had a really dedicated group from the University of Alaska come down. They had just conducted their own field season for months. They came down for 7 weeks to help us. We had a 7-week survey season planned. And in the second week of the survey season, the aircraft malfunctioned. We didn't have a backup on hand, so we had to have one shipped in from Alaska. It took about 10 days. And we missed 35% of our site surveys. The second year, we had a backup aircraft on hand, but things go on. You get sand in the lens, overwrite data files in the field, still learning. By 2014, we had it down. Things went fairly well. We made it through the majority of the season, and then there was a court case that reversed a decision that was allowing us to fly, and we voluntarily backed out of the field. We could survey a known spawning site from a helicopter in 1 to 2 minutes. With a SWAS, it was taking us about a half hour per site, and that includes time running up and down the river with the boat, going through checklists, and so forth. So we had 518 successful takeoffs, 517 successful landings. The best way we found to land these things was to catch them. Okay, so now here's I think I'm doing okay on time. So as part of the COA, we actually had to have a real pilot on site watching us. And so we've got a new pilot coming on next year. And I talked to him the other day and he just made me laugh because I said, were you excited about going out and doing this year? He goes, well, yeah, I am, but I'm not certified to fly these things, but I can catch them. So he's a real pilot. So in cost, there's kind of some hidden stuff here because we amortized the cost of the SWAS over 5 years. There's not a real big cost difference. In our case, we bought 2 systems, or Idaho Power Company bought 2 systems, and they were about $8,000 a piece. And we souped them up a little bit with GoPro cameras. So there isn't a big cost difference between the 2 methods. One of the big differences is the image analysis is just powerful. I mean, it's really, really powerful. If you've ever counted anything from an aircraft, you know how it is. In this case, we could go out over consecutive weeks, collect imagery data, come back to the office, put it on 2 big large screen monitors in a dark room, adjust contrast, and count. And as a result of that, what we found is when we flew known spawning sites with both from manned helicopter and from using the SWAS, we generally got higher counts using the SWAS. So we were undercounting reds from the helicopter. So the next portion of the test I'd like to talk about are the survey sampling methods. So each year, before we went in the field, we adopted a method. And then the first year we used stratified random sampling. So we stratified the sites based on their historic use, went out and subsampled a portion of the sites, got the data together, came back, made our estimates. Now, this bothered me right away because in 2012, what we have there is we have an estimate that's higher than the observed count. Now, 2012 was the year where we only completed 65% of our surveys. So we didn't get a full count of all the sites over the course of the season. So I'm questioning, how do we have a higher estimate than what was observed? In the second year, we used stratified random sampling again. We completed more of our sites than in previous years. But again, we're getting an estimate that's higher than the observed. And Michelle, she was looking at the precision of these estimates. And she wanted to get tighter confidence intervals. And so the third year of our test, we tried sampling proportional to size. Now that year, if we think back to the slide I showed earlier, that was our best survey year. We nailed it. But when we plugged our numbers into the method statistical models, we ended up with an estimate that was biased low. So we did a lot of simulation analysis that I won't get into, but the take-home message is this: when you go from a complete census count to a subsample, you can end up with statistical estimates with some uncertainty. So, the question is there a better way to do it? Good question. And I struggle with answering that question because from my perspective, there is no doubt that using small unmanned aircraft reduces the risk inherent to flying in a manned aircraft. There is no doubt that at the site level, we can get more accurate count data. But what I mean here by discordant information flow during a period of transition is this. In 2015, Philip said, I'm retiring in 2016. I'm not flying anymore. And so we did our Snake River surveys in Hell's Canyon by use of SWAS. What we ended up in my view, is a statistical estimate with some uncertainty because we still don't have everything quite figured out yet. On the other hand, we've got colleagues that work for the Nez Perce tribe that conduct manned aircraft flights in several other rivers. And then we provide that information to managers to make decisions. And in that case, there's little doubt what we've got is we've got a complete census count. I mean, we covered the whole rivers, but they're inaccurate counts. And so I'm hoping what we see is there's a lot of interest worldwide in using small unmanned aircraft to count animals, plants, so forth. And I have to believe that at some point in time, the technology has become available where we could do a complete census count. Maybe we have to follow it up the river with a boat, but maybe you can't just launch it from an airport and it comes back. But we can get there, and I think that policymakers, managers, and researchers like me, we have to lead the call for access to that technology. And with that,
yeah. First question, Roberta, just help yourself.
My question is about the cost estimates that you had between the cost difference for the helicopter flights and the remotely operated aircraft. Mm-hmm. Did you include the increased time that you needed to spend doing the surveys?
Yeah, that was the biggest factor. So on one hand, we have $1,000 an hour for a manned helicopter flight, so that bumps that up. But then the manpower, the labor, really bumps the cost of the SWAS up.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you're managing all the data that you're generating.
So they collect all this video image, and then they get in this room, and it takes a couple weeks to go through and count every red that they think is a red. And you get two people counting it. It's amazing how accurate they are, because it was my first time to go and just check it out, and I'm going, how are you guys counting these? But having the permanent record gives you the ability to go back, and you could do a very quantitative analysis, which from the helicopter you have no record. You just have someone's count, which is very inaccurate, particularly under some of the densities we're seeing now. But for the amount, I don't know how much video record they collected, but it took about 2 weeks. It's still a manual process to do it.
And it's accessible to others outside of the project group?
You could probably get it from Idaho Power, but
Right.
generally they own that data.
Billy, so one thing, did anybody contemplate when you did manned aircraft, instead of observation, just doing like geo-rectified photographs, so you'd have the same kind of information, you know, where you can fly the entire reach and then have that permanent record. So is that ever contemplated?
Howard, when this whole issue came up, that was the first thing I said. I said, let's put cameras on the struts, we'll GPS everything. We won't send bios up, but we'll send the pilots up because they want to fly. And we did do some tests. The complications arise when it comes to angle and light, and I think we can still get there. But you can sit in the Philip had a GoPro on his head, for example, and he's looking out the window and he could see 30 reds. And he videoed it for me, and he brought it back and he said, this is what happens when you take pictures out of the helicopter. You couldn't see anything. But I think that opportunity is real.
Controlling the drone, was that strictly line of sight, or did you go around the corners of the canyon and fly it down?
It's strictly line of sight. And the opportunity is there with the software that comes with it to let it fly autonomously. But in this case, I think it actually had a chip that limited the distance you could fly it, but it was line of sight.
Yeah, Billy, I just want to make sure I'm trying to understand the bullet 2, which is the SWAS count data at sites are accurate. So I guess a couple of questions. I think that means that they're accurate relative to the helicopter counts, correct?
Correct.
And then if that's true, I'm reflecting back to the one slide you had with the big blob and the n equals question mark.
You betcha.
And so there's a lot of variability potentially, and so are they accurate? Two questions then. Are the SWAS counts accurate relative to the helicopter counts because both have lots of variability? And can you comment on the sort of accuracy, not relative to the helicopter counts, but just to what you really think is out in the stream?
Right. Well, there is a lot of subjectivity in counting reds, whether it be from the aircraft or from a video image. And we've talked about that ourselves. Ultimately, you're always faced with a question as to whether or not a fish is actually constructing. Is this a test dig, for example? Is this a full red? So you're making these subjective calls all the way around the board. And I think the solution to that is that we've got to get some kind of technology that's automated that will measure disturbed surface area and then come together and come up with an agreed upon surface area per red to get a more repeatable process, because subjectivity is large in this counting process.
So I've got a question, Billy. If you had to look in your crystal ball, knowing that there's technology out there that we might be able to use now, how long do you think it's going to take before us animal biologists, you didn't mention birds, but I'm going to put
Birds, plants,
birds,
you betcha.
before we'll have that available to use within the service?
I think that's going to be one of our biggest limitations. I think it's going to take us a while to get a hold of that technology. And there's good reasons for it. I mean, there's security reasons for it. But I just don't think it's going to come very easily. But that's why, again, though, I would look at people like Robin and other policy level folks and say, put the pressure on the system and make that technology available.
Well, thanks.